It's always, as I was saying, a very pleasant surprise to see so many of you show up for this program, and it's good that we have a good crowd for this, because I think you're going to enjoy and actually learn a lot from this program this evening. This is this next to the last program in our series, in conjunction with the exhibit out in the hall, Alexander Hamilton, the Man Who Made Modern America. I think up to now, including the exhibit and most of the programs that we've had, everyone has gotten a very good opinion, probably, of Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton has kind of had his say. Mr. Hamilton himself was here, as some of you know, last Thursday to kind of present his case. And these last two programs that were the one this evening and the one next Thursday, we're going to get other people's opinions of Alexander Hamilton. First, this evening, the opinion of 4 of his colleagues, and then on Thursday, the opinion of a noted historian, Dr. Billy Smith from Montana State University, will be here to give what's billed as an alternative view of Alexander Hamilton. So I'm hoping that most of you who are here this evening will want to come to that program as well. It's always good to have balance in these things, and that's what we endeavor to do, especially with these two programs. As you're going to find out tonight, the 4 presidents or future presidents who were associated with Alexander Hamilton had very mixed opinions of him, to say the least. And that's what we hope to get out of this program this evening, I suppose. What you need to do is kind of use your imaginations, because our 4 presidents who are here this evening decided to show up in modern fashion, in modern clothes. As you can see, 2 of them are even sporting beards, and if you've read the latest issue of Time magazine, you'll know that beards are now back in style. So they must have read that and decided not to shave. I'm sure that's what it was. And I think it's also very fitting that we're having this program on the anniversary of the birth of probably America's most popular president. What better night to have 4 American presidents here, gracing us with their presence. And the way this is going to work this evening, I will introduce each president just prior to his having his say for about 10 to 15 minutes. And after all of the presidents have spoken, there will be some time for questions and answers. And I'm sure all of these great men will be more than willing to take all questions. It's not very often that they show up all together in Missoula, Montana, or all together anywhere, as a matter of fact. So, our first president this evening. This gentleman was born in 1832.
1832?
1732, thank you. It says right on there, 1732. 1732, into a Virginia planter family, and he learned the morals and manners and a body of knowledge requisite for an 18th century Virginia gentleman. He pursued 2 intertwined interests, military arts and Western expansion. At the age of 16, he helped survey the Shenandoah lands for Thomas Lord Fairfax. He was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in 1754, and he fought in the first skirmish in what grew into the French and Indian War, and basically in Europe later, the 7 Years' War. From 1759 to the outbreak of the American Revolution, he managed his lands around Mount Vernon and served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He married a widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. When the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia in May of 1775, he was one of the Virginia delegates, and he was elected as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and he served this post with distinction throughout the War for American Independence. In 1787, he served as President of the Constitutional Convention, and with the ratification of that great document, he was unanimously chosen as the nation's first president, and he served in that office with distinction for 2 full terms. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable George Washington.
I'm glad you didn't mention Fort Necessity. I deeply appreciate that.
It was on here. I left it out.
Thank you. Good evening. I think it is most fitting that we meet on the occasion on the birth of the man who saved the Republic that us four presidents and Alexander Hamilton did so much to create. I know that Hamilton would undoubtedly share in this sentiment. My relationship with Hamilton spanned over 20 years. It can be divided into three main phases. In our first phase, I will talk about our service together in the glorious War for Independence. Then I'll talk about our work toward a more perfect union, which was clearly necessary. And I will devote the bulk of my presentation tonight on his faithful and dedicated service as my Secretary of the Treasury during my first administration as President of the United States. I fully realize that of the four presidents on this panel, I most likely enjoyed the most positive relationship with this outstanding American patriot. First, as far as our service in the American Revolution is concerned, I found Hamilton to be, in the initial phases of the war, to be an outstanding field commander. He showed great courage in Fort Washington, in the siege of Fort Washington and on Long Island. And most importantly, he helped win a critical victory for me at the Battle of Trenton, and my beleaguered army was on the verge of collapse. We needed that win in the most desperate manner, and Hamilton came through brilliantly at the ripe old age of 21 years old. That being said, it was brought to my attention that Hamilton possessed administrative skills which were in high demand and short supply on my traveling field command staff. I found Hamilton to be most dependable. He took down my shorthand. He covered my correspondence. He wrote dispatches. He was my intermediary between my generals and myself. His faithful and dedicated service over that 5-year span of time was invaluable. And yet I also was well aware that he wanted something more. He wanted a field command desperately, and I frankly didn't want to let him go. Well, our tensions did eventually come to a head in March of 1781. It has been said that I am not the easiest person to work for, that I am long on criticism and short on praise of my subordinates. I have a lot on my mind as commander of the Continental Army. I cannot stand around at the top of a banister waiting for my aide to finish a conversation with an old friend while I need messages. And so I lost my temper. And unfortunately, Mr. Hamilton lost his. And he resigned from my staff, and frankly, at that time, I was fine to see him go until the next day. I pulled him aside. I tried to work it out. He would have nothing to do with it. He wanted a field command, and I relented. It turns out to be quite a providential decision. For later in that year, in October of 1781, Colonel Hamilton led an offensive that trapped Cornwallis for good at the decisive Battle of Yorktown. And with that was a devastating blow toward British morale, which helped our cause see to an end. We almost lost it all, however, in 1783. My generals had not been paid for years. The weak and ineffective Continental Congress of the Articles of Confederation had not paid my generals, and even the most loyal and dedicated servants at times can lose faith. My generals were on the verge of walking off the job at a critical moment of victory. Hamilton, I believe, intemperately suggested that I bring the weight of the Continental Army to bear on that Continental Congress to force them to come up with the needed funds. Gratefully, I was able to, with the help of my glasses, get through such a stifling period. I don't know whether or not, and I will never divulge, whether it was planned, but I was going to read a letter from the Continental Congress about how I was going to pay the troops, and I put on my glasses and said, "Gentlemen, please forgive me. In the service of my country, not only has my hair grown gray, but now I am going blind." There wasn't a dry eye in the place after I finished my letter. I thought it was a pretty good letter. Hamilton, however, I did admonish that the Army is not an instrument to be trifled with in political matters. And yet we both shared the same concern, that the Articles of Confederation were not working. The Articles of Confederation Congress lacked the ability to regulate the states, which were acting as 13 independent sovereign nations, each with their own currency, each with their own monetary policy, and was causing enormous economic discord for our republic. All that we had worked for was on the verge of destruction. And the alarm bell that came, that sounded in the night, was Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Note with interest, this was just a couple of months after the Annapolis Convention, when we did reluctantly try to have a meeting to revise the Articles of Confederation. Only 5 states were represented, and only 12 delegates attended, including my colleague, Mr. Madison. Thank goodness Mr. Hamilton suggested that we try again in another year in Philadelphia, and Shays' Rebellion made this country realize the peril with which we were confronted. And so in May of 1787, Colonel Hamilton, I call him Colonel occasionally, and I were reunited at the Philadelphia Convention. This time, 12 of the 13 states attended, 55 delegates, all were representing the 12 states. Only Rhode Island chose not to attend, and nobody missed them. As you know, I was elected president of the convention. Hamilton was from a divided delegation from the state of New York. Both of us sat through 4 months of sweltering meetings in Philadelphia, from May through September of 1787. Passions and tempers ran high. Conflicting ideas clashed, and it seemed at one point in time that our convention was in danger of dissolution. Hamilton rose on June 18th and gave a 5.5-hour speech outlining his plan for a more perfect union. Sadly, it resembled too much the British plan: a president to serve for a life term, a legislature that would serve for a life term based on good behavior, a president with absolute veto power. Logically, naturally, most of the delegates, including myself, I must suggest, felt a little put off by Hamilton's proposal, that it was too resemblant of the monarchy of Great Britain. I remember one delegate sarcastically commenting that I don't want to replace George III with George I. I felt that, however, his proposal, although rejected outright, did make the delegates realize that they had to work a little harder, and perhaps that great compromise that had been suggested just a couple of days earlier was not such a bad idea after all. And it helped us get through a very challenging stumbling block at that convention, and we were able to finish the work we were in Philadelphia. Out of the 55 delegates that signed that document, 39, or that attended the meeting, only 39 signed it. And I note with interest that Mr. Hamilton's was the only signature from the state of New York. Clearly, the next phase of establishing a more perfect union had yet to begin: the ratification by the states. I'm happy to say that the process seemed to go fairly smoothly. And on June 21st, 1788, we achieved our 9th state, New Hampshire, that had ratified the Constitution, putting it over the top and making it the law of the land. But as you are probably well aware, 2 large states, I'm ashamed to admit my own state of Virginia, and Hamilton's state of New York, had not ratified. It would be difficult to have a decent republic without those 2 powerful states included. And this is where Alexander Hamilton and my colleague, Mr. Madison, came up big time for the United States. I don't think Washington ever said big time. Hamilton wrote no fewer than 51 of the 84 letters to the editor, collectively known as the Federalist Papers. These were monumental projects, and he single-handedly carried the state of New York from opposing the Constitution toward ratifying it. And my colleague, Mr. Madison, did a masterful job, dare I suggest, taking on the formidable Patrick Henry in their ratifying convention. In Virginia, approved the Constitution 70-60, and New York approved the Constitution 30-27. A narrow victory indeed. Both men's efforts were tireless and dedicated toward giving us that more perfect union. As has been mentioned, I was unanimously elected first president of the United States. I needed advice, I needed help, and I turned to Mr. Hamilton, logically, and Mr. Jefferson as my Secretary of State. It's therefore in this third phase I'd like to address where Alexander Hamilton truly served this great republic, and that was as my Secretary of the Treasury. I needn't tell you how our financial situation during the Articles was so pathetic that we needed drastic revision, and Hamilton came with a plan. He released it with his report on credit and manufacturing, and that was a several-point agenda of establishing an economy that could be stable, and fulfill his vision of the United States as being a country of influence and destiny, a major player in the world with opportunity for all of its citizens. There are several points to his report on credit manufacturing, but in the interest of time, I shall only dwell on two of them. Both were objected to, of course, by my friend, Mr. Jefferson. In fact, I think just about every proposal in the report on credit and manufacturing was rejected by Mr. Jefferson. The first was the debt assumption bill. The previous Articles of Confederation governments, state governments, had accrued a debt of $77 million, an astronomical sum of money. Hamilton suggested that the new republic assume those debts, even though some states had been frugal during the Articles period while other states had not. All had to cover that debt to have full faith and credit in the American economy and in American promissory notes. Secondly, and most controversially, Mr. Hamilton suggested that we create a Bank of the United States. This would serve a couple of purposes. First, the Bank of the United States would handle revenue collection as well as federal payments to individuals. Secondly, and I believe far more importantly, the National Bank would serve as a regulatory mechanism to ensure that the states were brought under control. Clearly, the Articles of Confederation period showed that the states on their own, when left to their own devices, failed to see the big picture, and America's national interest of all of its citizens are undermined. We remember very distinctly during that Articles period that a lot of my soldiers who went through so much for the cause of independence lost everything in their newfound freedom under this horrible plan of government. In foreign policy, Hamilton and I were both confronted with the serious challenge of an Anglo-French war brought about by the French Revolution in 1793. And while the Jeffersonian faction virulently urged us to join our French friends, Hamilton and I shared the opinion that this was the last thing this nation needed at such a fragile time in our early years. There are a couple of reasons why. First, a young republic, the last thing a young republic needs in its economy that is developing is a foreign war. A foreign war of any kind would be disastrous toward the prospects of our future. Secondly, siding with the French Revolution, in our opinion, would have been considered to be a cataclysmic mistake. The French Revolution and the Jacobin rule of Maximilien Robespierre was nothing that we felt we wanted to be associated with. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't just tyranny that we feared. Far greater on my mind was mobocracy. The mobocracy that we witnessed at Shays' Rebellion. The mobocracy of the September massacres in 1792, when people crowded the Paris jails and beheaded 2,000 people with the shadow of a trial. False trials followed by real executions. This was nothing that we wanted to be connected with in our young republic. I realize that Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Monroe more fervently did not share our concerns, and yet we clung to that belief. Finally, I owe Mr. Hamilton a debt for writing our country to steer clear of foreign entanglements. I believe it is sound today as a president. That being said, we were not without our tensions. Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson, as you are well aware, had massive feuds, and those feuds carried over into the free press. And I must confess that I found myself the target of much abuse from both sides, because I would not take one. I asked both of these gentlemen to please calm their feuds, and I found it to be quite detrimental toward my administration. Finally, I'd like to close with a comment that I wrote to Henry Lee after Shays' Rebellion. I think it explains how I feel about Mr. Hamilton. This was just a week after Shays' Rebellion when the news came down to Virginia. I am mortified beyond expression when I view the clouds which have spread over the brightest morn that ever dawned upon any country. Let us have a government by which our lives, our liberties, and our properties will be secured. To be more humiliated in the eyes of the world and more contemptible than we already are is hardly possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks in large part to Mr. Hamilton's visionary efforts, those fears I expressed in 1786 were allayed, and I believe we owe him a debt that can never fully be repaid. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our next speaker probably was more remarkable as a political philosopher rather than a politician. He once said, "People and nations are forged in the fires of adversity," and he doubtless was thinking as much of his own career as he was of the American experience. This man was born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1735. A Harvard-educated lawyer, he early became identified with the Patriot cause. He was a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congresses, and he led in the movement for American independence. During the Revolutionary War, he served in France and Holland in diplomatic roles and helped negotiate the Treaty of Peace. From 1785 to 1788, he was minister to the court of St. James, returning to be elected vice president under President Washington. In 1797, he was elected to succeed Washington as the nation's second president. His single term as president was marked by a near war with France, which he managed to skillfully avoid. He also is the father of the sixth president of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable John Adams.
Thank you. Vanity, I am sensible, is my cardinal vice and cardinal folly. Popularity was never my mistress, nor was I ever or shall ever be a popular man. Further, my temper in general has been tranquil, except when instances of extraordinary madness, deceit, hypocrisy, ingratitude, treachery, or perfidy has suddenly struck me. Then I have always been irascible enough. There have been many times in my life when I have been so agitated in my own mind as to have no consideration at all of the light in which my words, actions, or even writings would be considered by others. These traits have governed and typified my relations with Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton's origin is not in question and greatly accounts for his later career. He was born on a speck more obscure than Corsica, from an origin not only contemptible but infamous, with infinitely less courage and capacity than Bonaparte. As a foreigner, Mr. Hamilton was devoid of knowledge of the American character or true appreciation of the Revolution's patriots, and could scarcely acquire the opinions, feelings, or principles of the American people. In effect, Mr. Hamilton was a preening, uppity young man who had missed the formative struggles of the Revolution dating back to the 1760s. Attaching himself to General Washington during the War for Independence, Mr. Hamilton at first proved to be a valuable support for the general, but his true self emerged in the latter days of that conflict. At Yorktown, General Washington had ordered, or was about to order, another officer to take command of the attack upon the redoubt. Hamilton flew into a violent passion and demanded the command of the party for himself, and declared if he had it not, he would expose General Washington's conduct in a pamphlet. Typically, Hamilton's instrument of offense were libels. Then, during President Washington's administration, I discovered myself increasingly isolated from the halls of administration and found Mr. Hamilton to be flamboyant, lascivious, and egotistical, a conceited, conniving upstart who had been unfairly catapulted to the supremacy of that administration. It is true that Mr. Hamilton took on an increasingly powerful role, as Old Muttonhead was better at striking heroic poses than providing leadership. He could not even write a sentence without misspelling some word. In fact, he was very superficially read in the history of any age, nation, or country. It was natural that in that vacuum, someone of Mr. Hamilton's ilk should assume leadership. And Mr. Hamilton lived in a delirium of ambition. He had been blown up with the vanity by the Tories, and had fixed his eye on the highest station in America, and he hated every man, young or old, who stood in his way. I lacked Mr. Hamilton's peculiar financial acumen and favored a nation of small farmers. I expressed grave reservations about aspects of his economic program. thinking that it was informed by the mercenary spirit of commerce, and believed that his system would swindle the poor and release the gangrene of avarice into the American atmosphere. As a man, the Mr. Hamilton I knew was a proud, spirited, conceited, aspiring mortal, always pretending to morality, but with as debauched morals as old Franklin, who is more his model than anyone I know. He had a superabundance of secretions which he could not find whores enough to draw off. His fornications, his indelicate pleasures, his licorice flirtation with a married woman at a dinner party, his adulteries and his incest was propagated far and wide. His roguish deeds can be traced back to his days on General Washington's staff, followed by his debaucheries in New York and Philadelphia, at which he had made his audacious and unblushing attempts upon ladies of the highest rank and purest virtue. During my administration, I found Mr. Hamilton to be an insolent coxcomb who rarely dined in good company where there was good wine, without getting silly and vaporing about my administration like some young girl about her brilliance and trinkets. I have oft been criticized for keeping President Washington's cabinet. I wanted to be a nonpartisan president, and in doing so, I abdicated the role of partisan leader. In holding myself apart from Mr. Hamilton, the sovereign pontiff of federalism, I knew that I would cause all of Mr. Hamilton's cardinals to excite the whole church to excommunicate and anathematize me. Yet I accepted Mr. Washington's cabinet. The great general had appointed them, and I knew it would turn the world upside down if I removed any of them. I knew all along that Mr. Hamilton controlled the cabinet, because he had already controlled it under Mr. Washington. The truth is, Hamilton's influence was over Washington was so well known that Washington was merely the titular president, a viceroy under Hamilton. Furthermore, I found that if I had not the previous consent of the heads of departments and the approbation of Mr. Hamilton himself, I ran the utmost risk of a dead negative in the Senate. Mr. Hamilton's interference in the affairs of my administration went beyond the control of my cabinet and began directly after my inauguration, when he sent me an unsolicited memorandum suggesting policies for the new administration. This long, elaborate letter was a whole system of instruction for the conduct of the President, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. I read it very deliberately and really thought the man was in a delirium. Upon taking office in 1797, I had received a memo from Mr. Hamilton recommending an alien and sedition law. I recommended no such thing in my speech. Congress, however, adopted both of these measures. I knew there was need enough for both, and therefore consented to them. But as they were then considered as war measures and intended altogether against the advocates of the French and peace with France, I was apprehensive that a hurricane of clamor might be raised against them. And indeed they were. As our difficulties with France increased during the latter 1790s, I believed, unlike many other Federalists, that a navy and a militia would suffice to guard the country, and I feared a large standing army as a many-bellied monster. However, during the war scare, Mr. Hamilton saw a chance to self-aggrandize himself and advanced a pet project for a 50,000-man army. This army appeared to me to be one of the most wild extravagances of a knight-errant. It proved to me that Mr. Hamilton knew no more of the sentiments and feelings of the people of America than he did those of the inhabitants of one of the planets. As my dear wife Abigail has described the gentleman, he was a little Mars or a second Bonaparte. In truth, I was, as president, a mere cipher due to the machinations of that individual. During the early years of my administration, Mr. Hamilton's friends had encouraged him to serve in the Senate and had even encouraged me to appoint him as Secretary of War. However, he was stalking a bigger game, the leadership of the new army. With the presidency foreclosed to him, this was a shiny, irresistible lure to one who had always craved military fame. Through intrigue and collusion, he got General Washington to accept command of this new army, with the general insisting that he, Hamilton, would serve as second in command, as Inspector General. Jockeying for position over more senior and more qualified officers, such as Generals Knox, Pinckney, Lincoln, and Gates, I believed that if I had consented to the appointment of him as second in rank, it would rank as the most irresponsible action of my whole life and the most difficult to justify. He was not a native of the United States, but a foreigner, and, I believe, had not resided much longer in North America than had Albert Gallatin, our Swiss-born leader of the House of Representatives. His rank in the late Army was comparatively very low. I knew that Hamilton had no popular character in any part of America, but I had no choice. I was at no more liberty than a man in prison. How shall I describe to you my sensations and reflections at that moment? Mr. Hamilton demanded a meeting. I was in good humor and received him civilly. He repeated over and over again how there was no use making a treaty with France and how we should form an alliance with England. His eloquence and his vehemence wrought the little man up to such a degree of heat and effervescence, I thought for sure he was going to have a fit. I told him calmly that I disagreed with just about everything that he said. He was obviously completely ignorant about France, England, and everywhere else. Never in my life did I hear a man talk more like a fool, and I took no more notice of his puppyhood. But Mr. Washington crammed him down my throat, and I was compelled to appoint the most restless, impatient, artful, unprincipled intriguer in the United States to be the commander of the army. He was an unmitigated, underhanded intriguer, a man devoid of any moral principles, a bastard and a foreigner, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. I grew increasingly worried about the militaristic tendencies and authoritarian side that had emerged in the frustrated, restless behavior of this Scottish Creolian of Nevis. Mr. Hamilton's imagination was always haunted by that hideous monster or phantom so often called a crisis and which so often produces imprudent measures. I congratulate myself that I ultimately restrained Mr. Hamilton, who, save for me, would have involved us in a foreign war with France and a civil war with ourselves. When I finally removed Messrs. McHenry and Pickering from my cabinet, Mr. Hamilton went completely mad and began to work behind the scenes to get Charles Cotesworth Pinckney elected president in 1800. He attempted to persuade enough electors to not vote for myself as president, which would then have propelled Mr. Pinckney to that office over myself and Messrs. Jefferson and Burr, the Republicans in that contest. He championed Mr. Pinckney as somebody more pliant to his own ambitions, as someone who would create an army of horse and foot with Mr. Hamilton at their head. In the process, Mr. Hamilton and his band killed themselves and indicted me for the murder of the Federalist Party. The subsequent tie in the Electoral College between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Burr delighted me greatly. The very two men of all the world that he was most jealous of were now placed above the Creole bastard. His death at the hands of Mr. Burr saddened me, as it did all reasonable men. No one wished to get rid of him that way. And it is remarkable to me that his death was marked by such a general grief, while Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had done so much more for the American cause, died in comparative obscurity. Vice, folly, and villainy are not to be forgotten because the guilty wretch repented in his dying moments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a feeling you won't be taking tea at Mount Vernon real soon. Our next presenter is a powerful advocate of liberty. He was born in 1743 in Albemarle County, Virginia, and inherited from his father, a planter and a surveyor, some 5,000 acres of land, and from his mother, a Randolph, high social standing. He studied at the College of William and Mary and then read law. In 1772, he married Martha Wales Skelton, a widow, and took her to live at his partly constructed mountaintop home, Monticello. In the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Continental Congress, he contributed his pen rather than his voice to the patriot cause. As the silent member of the Congress, Jefferson, at the age of 33, drafted the Declaration of Independence. In the years following, he labored to make its words a reality in Virginia. Most notably, he wrote a bill establishing religious freedom, enacted in 1786. He succeeded Benjamin Franklin as minister to France in 1785, and as a reluctant candidate for president in 1796, he came within 3 votes of being elected. Through a flaw in the Constitution, he became vice president, although an opponent for the President Adams. He was elected president in a landmark election of 1800, although it took 36 votes in the House of Representatives to break a tie between him and Aaron Burr. Highlights of his 2 terms in the presidency included the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, a war against the Barbary Pirates, and a highly controversial trade embargo. Ladies and gentlemen, the 3rd President of the United States, the Honorable Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow citizens. It's an honor to appear before you tonight to defend myself against the calumnies of Mr. Alexander Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton and I are sometimes mentioned in the same breath, he as the epitome of American conservatism, and me as the essence of American liberalism, 2 polarities on the political spectrum. I would say that Mr. Hamilton was so far off the American political spectrum that he stood forthright in England, whereas I represented all that was good and all that was proper and all that was American about our new country. I must admit I did not know Mr. Hamilton well. I knew of him, but I did not encounter him until we served in the cabinet of President Washington early in the 1790s. As you know, I was abroad during the late 1780s as the American minister to France. I did not attend the Constitutional Convention. I was kept aware of its proceedings by my friend Mr. Madison, who at that time had nothing but praise for Mr. Hamilton, although he warned me that Hamilton had delivered a 5.5-hour speech advocating the imposition of an English constitution in America. I read the Federalist Papers that Mr. Madison submitted to me while I was in France, and I must admit I admired Mr. Hamilton's forthright defense of the new constitutional framework. So I was surprised and saddened when I encountered him at the beginning of the 1790s in Mr. Washington's administration. I was still the American minister to France when the new government began in the spring of 1789. I was not notified of my appointment as Secretary of State until the summer of that year, and I did not arrive back in the United States until December of 1789. The new government had already been in operation for 8 long months. And by the time I made my way to New York City to take up my duties as Secretary of State, it was March of 1790. Mr. Hamilton had already been on the scene for over 6 months, and he had a strong lead that I was never able to overcome. I noticed immediately the kingly nature of the conversations, the political conversations we had in New York. And Mr. Hamilton had already submitted his report on public credit and had already made great strides towards its achievement when I came on the scene. But there was one issue that had not been resolved, and that was the issue of assumption. Now, Mr. Madison and I had no doubt that the national debt of the United States needed to be funded and paid in full. There was some disagreement over who owned that debt and who should be remunerated, but the national debt was a debt of honor and had to be funded and repaid. But an entirely different issue was Mr. Hamilton's proposal to assume the state debts of the Revolutionary era and add them to the national debt, thereby almost doubling the size of the national debt in what could only be seen by any reasonable American as a totally unfair solution to a non-existent problem. Because some states had already taxed themselves to pay off their Revolutionary War debts. Other states had not done so, but now all Americans were to be taxed by Mr. Hamilton to pay off the debts of all of the Revolutionary War states. I am pleased to say that assumption, that pernicious doctrine, failed in the House of Representatives on 4 separate occasions. But then Mr. Hamilton invited Mr. Madison and myself to a dinner. And at that dinner he begged, he pleaded, he groveled to persuade us to support assumption. He argued, and it was a powerful argument at the moment, that the Union itself was at stake, and that if the state debts were not assumed, added to the national debt, and funded, several states, especially South Carolina, from our own southern region, would secede from the Union. Mr. Hamilton also intimated that the national debt he would create would be paid off, as all honest citizens pay their debts. So Mr. Madison and I reluctantly agreed at that dinner in April of 1790 to persuade a few representatives from Pennsylvania and a few more from Maryland to shift their votes in favor of the federal assumption of state debts. In return, we situated the national capital, then located in New York City, in the city of Philadelphia for 10 years, after which it was to be relocated near Georgetown in Maryland on the Potomac River. This was the famous capital bargain of 1790. I admit, in retrospect, that we were flamboozled by Mr. Hamilton. There was no serious threat of secession should assumption fail, and Mr. Hamilton, it quickly became apparent, had no intention of paying off the national debt. A public debt properly funded, he proudly said, is a public blessing, as if it is a good thing for a citizen or a nation to owe money. I quickly came to realize that Mr. Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. He sought to implement the English system in America. He sought to engraft English aristocracy, monarchy, and corruption on our American Constitution. Here is another example. Mr. Hamilton's second report on public credit called for the creation of a national bank in which the private bankers would be using public money, a dangerous blending of the crossing of public and private lines. The government would deposit its money in this bank, and private bankers, who compose 80% of the directors of the bank, would be using public money, your money and mine, to get rich in the private banking business. This bill passed the Congress thanks to Mr. Hamilton's patronage plans for its members, and stood on President Washington's desk when my friend Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General of the United States, delivered an opinion to the President that the bank was unconstitutional. Then Mr. Madison, a member of the Constitutional Convention, a man who, if anyone, should have known about the Constitution, also opined that the proposed Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. And Mr. Madison prevailed upon me, as Secretary of State, to submit an opinion of my own on the unconstitutionality of the proposed Bank of the United States. My argument was plain and simple, and I know you all agree with me. I said, the Constitution does not allow the Congress to charter a bank. There is no line in the Constitution anywhere which permits the government to charter a bank. If a bank is not permitted, it therefore is disallowed, because the government cannot do what it is not allowed to do by the Constitution. Isn't that a plain and simple, forthright? Mr. Hamilton answered cutely and said, it doesn't say we can't. It doesn't say we can't. Can you imagine anything that the government, that the Constitution does not say specifically is prohibited, is therefore allowed? Anything? I warned the President in my opinion on the constitutionality of the bank that if he signed that bill, it would open a boundless field of power. A boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. And I ask you, fellow citizens, tonight, if that is not what has happened in the course of our history. Although I must admit, truth be told, and entre nous, I used some of that power when I bought Louisiana. Mr. Hamilton and I also differed on the great French Revolution, which erupted soon after I left that country in the spring of 1789. Mr. Hamilton opposed the French Revolution and all that it seemingly stood for, and deplored the violence, the chaos, the anarchy that it seemed to spread. But Mr. Hamilton, and I must admit, Mr. Washington, were quite provincial in their attitudes. Neither of them had ever been to France. I had spent 5 marvelous years there. I admired French culture, French wine, French women, and I knew that the French Revolution was being waged and fought for the same ideals as our glorious American Revolution. We fought for liberty, for equality, and for the universality of these values. And I knew as Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Washington did not, that the conservative resistance to the revolution in France was far stronger and far more entrenched than it was in America. The French Revolution sought to abolish the monarchy, the titled nobility, and the established church. We fought against those things in America, but those institutions were almost non-existent. And where churches were lightly established, my bill in the Virginia legislature calling for liberty of conscience quickly brought about their disestablishment. So I knew that it took more violence, it took more bloodshed to overcome the entrenched conservative opposition to the forces of liberty, equality, and fraternity in France. And I knew that France had come to our aid in our revolution and had procured our independence at Yorktown and elsewhere. And therefore, it was not becoming our country to shun our ally in its hour of crisis. But Mr. Hamilton used the French Revolution to go behind my back, to talk with the British minister, Mr. Hammond, to assure him that we would not go to war, that we would not side openly with France, that we would not cut off trade with Great Britain. I had to ask myself, who was appointed the Secretary of State in this administration? Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the great mass of Americans fought the War of Independence to become something new, something different, something other than Great Britain. Mr. Hamilton and his small coterie of admirers seemingly fought the American Revolution to become another Great Britain. And his financial plans, his plans for debt and taxes and a strong executive and a corrupt legislature sought to engraft the British system on our young American republic. I therefore entered the lists against Mr. Hamilton in the public press, and I am happy to inform you that in the great revolution of 1800, he and his party and his ill designs were overthrown, I hope once and for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our next speaker was born in 1751 in Orange County, Virginia. He attended Princeton, which was then known as the College of New Jersey. A student of history and government, well-read in law, he participated in framing the Constitution for the state of Virginia in 1776 and served in the Continental Congress and was a leader in the Virginia Assembly. When the delegates to the Constitutional Convention assembled in Philadelphia, the 36-year-old Madison took frequent and emphatic part in the debates. He made a major contribution to the ratification of the Constitution by writing, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, the Federalist Essays. In later years, he was referred to frequently as the father of the Constitution. In Congress, he helped frame the Bill of Rights, and he helped to enact the first revenue legislation. After serving as President Jefferson's Secretary of State, he was elected president in his own right in 1808. His second term was probably more known later on than his first term because it was marked by a long and arduous war with England, which led to the burning of the national Capitol and the White House, and culminated in Andrew Jackson's brilliant victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the fourth President of the United States, the Honorable James Madison.
Good evening. It seems my lot in life to follow Thomas Jefferson and in the afterlife as well. Just to warn you that when I dug myself out of the grave this morning and came from Virginia to Missoula, I was feeling a little bit more self-reflective than usual. And so there's this standard story that I like to tell about my stormy, extremely stormy, and almost mercurial relationship with Alexander Hamilton. And it goes something like this. As we've heard, Hamilton and I established a working relationship in the Federal Congress under the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s. He was representing New York, I was representing Virginia. We both saw what a disastrous situation the weak government under the Articles of Confederation had put us in as a nation, and we jointly worked and pushed for a stronger national government. And as we know, that all worked out quite well in Philadelphia in 1787. Together, Hamilton and I guess a bunch of other delegates who were important as well, put our collective genius together and wrote the Constitution. And I'm glad to see, as I came out of the grave today, that it still stands after 220 some odd years. Quite impressive work. And I actually will take personal credit for most of that work. I actually stuck around the convention. Hamilton was a bit more in and out, couldn't stand the heat that was in Philadelphia. And actually, you should know that other than one other delegate, I actually spoke more than anyone at the Constitutional Convention. So thus, the father of the Constitution, I am. So after Philadelphia, as we've heard, Hamilton and I and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. And this was actually Hamilton's idea. I'll give him some credit here. There were some 85 essays that we wrote. We published them in New York newspapers. I guess when we wrote the Constitution, we were thinking that it would probably be a good idea to have the people ratify it. That way we could say the Constitution began with "we the people," as opposed to "we a bunch of wealthy white guys," which Hamilton might have considered doing. He might have been fine with that, but we went with ratification anyway. And in order to get it ratified, that's why we went with the Federalist Papers. That's why we had to mobilize public opinion to get the Constitution passed and ratified by the people. And it worked out. The Constitution was ratified, as we still have today. As you've heard, in the new government, Hamilton became the Secretary of the Treasury. And unlike the other three ex-presidents up here, I wasn't part of the Washington administration, at least not part of the cabinet. I went home to Virginia and represented Virginia in Congress. In Congress, I sponsored the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we think of as the Bill of Rights. This was a promise that I made during the ratification debates, and I felt compelled when entering Congress to fulfill that promise. But while I was in Congress, I was actually in the first couple years a trusted confidant of Washington. I was something of a special advisor to his administration in the first years of government. And all seemed great. And then, as things tend to do sometimes, it quickly turned around. And things were not so great. Hamilton, God bless him, proposed his economic program. As we've heard, the assumption of state debts, the funding of that debt such that the new federal government would have a permanent debt and it would have a string of domestic and foreign creditors. But ultimately, a small number of people were going to be economically tied to this new government. Third, a national bank to do the financial business of the state. And fourth, what we haven't said much about today was Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers, where Hamilton proposed that the federal government, in my perspective, should prematurely promote manufacturing capabilities. This included the creation of an industrial town in the town of Paterson in the great state of New Jersey. As my friend Jefferson suggested, I smelled corruption, I smelled aristocracy, I smelled monarchy. I'm not sure how good monarchy smells, but it was bad at that particular moment. I felt Hamilton was pushing for the creation of a highly centralized government like they had in Great Britain. And I thought that it was the kind of government that was really good at doing one thing, and that was going to war. And this was not the vision of the new government under the Constitution that I thought I had signed on to a few years earlier. I was extremely concerned that Hamilton's government was going to be a government of special privilege, not a government of the people. Maybe the we the people, that I was so concerned about starting the Constitution, that needed to be there. Maybe we, the few privileged, should have started it for Hamilton's government. I was also concerned that Hamilton's government was going to push the United States prematurely into a stage of economic development where vice-filled industrial cities were the norm. I mean, this is what was going on in England at the time during the English Industrial Revolution. I did not have that vision for the United States. I had much more of an agrarian vision, a farming vision. We had a lot of land in the United States. I broke with the administration. We formed a new political party, the Jeffersonian Republicans. We offered a constitutional perspective called strict construction that favored limiting the powers of the federal government. We favored states' rights. And to be honest with you, I never really looked back. I wasn't the slightest bit upset when Burr killed Hamilton. Not really. And just before I died, I still maintained that I had remained consistent in my beliefs about the new Constitution, that it was a true Republican government that I supported, and it was Hamilton who was an elitist, who was prone to monarchy, and who was supporting a nation that was going to be filled, or was filled, with corruption. So that's the story I usually tell, and as I said when I started, I was feeling rather self-reflective when I woke up today, and I can see that you guys are a really special audience, so I'm going to share some of my internal thoughts that I often don't voice. So I want to go to 2 points. First, the pre-Constitution years, and I like to think about the relationship that I had with Alexander Hamilton in the 1780s as something of a marriage of convenience. And it's probably good that he and I never had children together. But like many marriages of convenience, ours had a lot to do with money. We realized that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, and we looked around the United States in the 1780s and we saw bad government, inefficient government, but we also saw economic depression. A depression was on. When we had fought the revolution, we thought it would be a great economic boon to the nation. We were thinking that we would finally be free of British colonialism, the British mercantile system that forced American colonists to send their goods to particular places. In the aftermath of revolution, we were thinking free trade would reign, we could trade wherever we wanted, money would flow in. It didn't happen. When Great Britain lost the military war, they decided to fight an economic war instead. They banned U.S. ships from trading with the British Caribbean. American exports were at a standstill, and American gold and American silver, our money, was heading elsewhere, was heading overseas. So there was a fiscal crisis in the 1780s. Debt was the norm. American state governments were making it easy for Americans to repay their debts. They were absolving everyday citizens of their debts in a variety of ways. And creditors, American creditors and European creditors, were losing out. They were refusing to lend any more money to Americans because, quite understandably, they weren't sure that they could get their money back that they lent out. It wasn't a good investment to invest in the United States in the 1780s. So weak government at the national level, overly democratic government at the state level, overly democratic in the sense that state governments were too easily allowing debtors to escape from the debts that they had contracted, had created a financial crisis and a fiscal crisis and a credit crisis. And this is where Hamilton and I come back into the story. Because in the 1780s, Hamilton and I were young, we were single, and we were on the make. Watch out. In the 1780s, I was still in my 30s, or I was in my 30s, and I was still living in my father's house. I wanted to get out. Hamilton and I and many others needed money for investments. We had plans. We wanted to invest in land on the frontier. There was a number of different schemes that we had. But ultimately, we needed Europeans to lend us money in order to make that happen. In order to get out of Daddy's roof, I needed somebody to lend me some money. But as I suggested earlier, the climate in the 1780s, because of the weak governmental structure and the debtor-friendly situation, wasn't allowing me or Hamilton to get any of the money, any of the investors that we needed. So we wanted a new government that could salvage the national credit in a very self-interested way. Men like Hamilton and myself pushed for the new Constitution. Then the question becomes, why didn't I support Hamilton's economic program wholesale? And this is the second moment where I'm going to be more self-reflective than I would otherwise be. The problem I seriously had with Hamilton's program was that it favored elite merchants. It favored Eastern capitalists. I was not an Eastern capitalist. What was I? Anyone? I was a Virginia planter for sure. I was a Southern agrarian, but most importantly, I was a slaveholder. Hamilton envisioned an industrial nation in which capitalists exploited wage workers. I was a Southern planter, and I exploited black Americans. Hamilton and I had serious faults, and the nation that I've come back to life to see today might still be dealing with them. Hamilton's moneyed men, the elites of the East, controlling the federal government on the one hand, and on the other, the legacy of my slaveholding. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, we'll open it up for questions. Maybe the last chance you'll get to be in the same room with four such esteemed people. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for Thomas Jefferson. I have been told, Mr. Jefferson, that much as you fought Alexander Hamilton's theories, principles, and plans, when you became president, you governed as Hamilton had proposed. You mentioned the purchase of the Louisiana territories. Are there any other ways in which you might say that you followed the Hamiltonian model?
The question from the deluded guest in the audience is that I out-federalized the Federalists and governed in a Hamiltonian fashion. Let me just say two things. We cut the national debt in half during my administration. I did not believe that a public debt, however properly funded, was a public blessing. I thought a public debt should be paid off. The debt stood at $80 million when I assumed office, and when I left it was cut in half, down to $40 million. I take pride in that. And then frankly, young lady, if Mr. Madison is revealing his inner thoughts to this audience today, I will tell you forthrightly that I was blackmailed into continuing Hamilton's funding system, including the bank. As you have heard, I was tied in the Electoral College with Aaron Burr of New York. We were both elected President of the United States, and the House of Representatives was voting 1 vote per state. And for 35 ballots, I received 8 votes. I needed 9. There were 16 states in the nation. I needed 9. And Mr. Hamilton, along with Mr. Baird of Delaware and Mr. Morris of New York, approached a member of my party, General Samuel Smith of Baltimore, Maryland, who approached me. And this was the deal. Votes would be shifted in the House of Representatives to make me president over Burr, provided I did not dismantle the Navy, I did not upset the funding system, and I did not destroy the National Bank. I thought the consequences of not agreeing to those demands, the consequences, I believe, would have been not just the election of Mr. Burr, but the destruction of the country, were too great not to exceed. I did go a bit slow on patronage. I did not fire those deserving Federalists for a full 2 years. I did not fund the Army, and I did not fund the Navy, and I relied on gunboats, not battleships, for our defense. And in 1810, I raised not a finger to save the National Bank when its charter was not renewed by the Congress.
Yes.
This is a question for John Adams. Now, by your...
Yep, best to stand up.
Now, apparently you didn't like the government. But by your statements, he ran the government during Washington's administration, and he more or less ran the government during your administration. And given that, perhaps he didn't do such a bad job, did he?
Want the mic? You asked.
I'm not prepared to answer John Adams myself. I'll answer it as Bob Brown. All my remarks, virtually everything that I said, were taken from John Adams' writings. They're direct quotes with just a few transitions that I added. And yeah, he didn't particularly care for Hamilton. I think, however, that he and Hamilton had a lot more similarities and agreements than certainly with Jefferson or Madison. Adams was an intensely personal man. He took affronts deeply personal. As my opening remarks, he was very vain. He knew he'd never be a popular man. He always wanted to be a popular man. Up here, I feel like everybody's against me. Nobody likes me up here. And Hamilton particularly. So I think you're probably right that if you take a look at it dispassionately, Hamilton and Adams agreed more than they disagreed. But it's the personal animosity between the two of them that just, Adams really hated that guy. I think you could tell from his comments. But by and large, they were a lot closer.
Yes.
I'd like to speak to the question raised. That Hamilton
stand up.
Actually is a great man. Hamilton, because he secretly ran 2 Washington administrations and 1 Adams administration. By that standard, Dick Cheney is 2/3 of a Hamilton.
On Adams' benefit, and he might have ran the Adams administration for 2 years, but Adams finally got his back up and put him down, and kept us from war with France. As for Cheney and Hamilton, we'll let that remark just stand.
Is there a quality issue?
Further questions? Go ahead.
I have a question for all of you presidents. It was brought up by Mr. Madison that there was an economic boom for certain members of the Founding Fathers Committee. And I'd like you to address a book that you might have read during your time in the afterlife, The Economic Origins of the American Revolution. Charles Beard. What do you think of his argument? I believe it's coming back into favor. Would any of the presidents like to answer that question?
Well, it's undeniable that some of the founding fathers did prosper from the new plan, and those more, I think, looking at Beard's thesis, that those who opposed the ratification also had an economic interest or economic motive to do so. It's undeniable that the government of the Constitution was a huge improvement over what existed before, and I think that supersedes Beard's argument. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give it a 7.
Care to comment? Take a step this way.
Excuse me,
There we go.
Interesting question about Beard, and I do think some aspects of Beard are coming back into favor. I guess what I'd point out would be that Beard suggested that those that benefited from the Constitution were the original holders of government securities, government bonds. And what I was suggesting, or what Madison was suggesting, is that Madison and Hamilton were not holders of securities. They were looking for investment, or they were looking for investors, actually. So the economic interest argument is still there, but it's a different conceptualization of it.
When President Jefferson accused Hamilton of being a monarchist and for a monarchy bottomed on corruption, he did not use the term corruption in the modern sense as something illegal or something criminal. Corruption in 18th century England meant managing the legislature, the parliament. It was the court influence. It was the king providing jobs and sinecures for the members of parliament to ensure a working majority, a voting majority in the House of Commons. And that's exactly what Alexander Hamilton was doing in the United States Congress in 1789, 90, and 91. Especially through his funding scheme, he made sure that the leading Federalists owned a piece of the national debt, which he was either going to fund in full or fund partly and then give them some western lands on top of that. He was managing, he was institutionalizing a court faction, a Federalist party, if you will, in the U.S. Congress, and that is corruption.
Further questions? Anyone? Yes.
I'd like to know if President Washington feels that Alexander Hamilton had an undue influence in his administration.
Well, it's undeniable of all the members of my administration, he was the one I turned to the most for advice. And I appreciated his frank and candid opinions, and I found most of those opinions to be quite correct. If I could dare divulge away from your question just a bit, if Hamilton in his personal life had shown the same kind of farsightedness, he would have lived a lot longer, would have been a happier man.
Yes. You had a question?
It seems to me that Hamilton's contribution, he proposed some programs and his opponents didn't have an alternative. They just nitpicked and nibbled and criticized and opposed, but didn't articulate an alternative. What are your thoughts on that?
Another deluded questionnaire who clearly hasn't read the only book I ever published, Notes on the State of Virginia, which outlined in its entirety a plan alternate to that of Mr. Hamilton. It was an agrarian plan, a nation of farmers. I think when 85% of the American population made their living in agriculture, it was a sound and sensible plan for the future of the country. It sought to separate America from England by leaving our workshops in Europe, buying our manufactured goods so we would not have cities, sores on the body politic in America. We would pay for those commodities by selling our surplus agricultural products. I believe that was a sound, sensible, and workable agricultural economic development plan, and you, sir, should approve of that.
Anyone else? Yes.
I have a question for President Madison. Wasn't you take credit for being the father of the Constitution, but wasn't it based on the model that was written by John Adams for the state of Massachusetts, for which he gets no credit?
Do you want to give yourself some credit? And in the back. I think key aspects, for those of you who don't know, John Adams wrote the good parts of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. And key parts of that Constitution, particularly the separation of powers, the idea of balancing different aspects of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, I think is a key contribution that John Adams makes in a pamphlet, actually, that he writes called Thoughts on Government. That's extremely influential throughout the colonies, certainly something that Madison and other constitution makers were influenced by. I did not mean to take complete credit. Not too much.
You care to comment?
No, I think you already did.
Yes.
For President Jefferson, with benefit of hindsight and taking into account the state of the world today, and especially in the United States, do you think that your plan actually could have worked out to greater advantage than Hamilton's?
I certainly do. I certainly do.
Sure.
Since I'm being self-reflective, it kind of didn't work out too well if you consider the War of 1812. When the bank, Hamilton's Bank, ended in 1811 for its 20-year charter, and the United States went to war with England, it had an extremely difficult time financing that war. And after the war was over, in 1815, I supported chartering the second bank of the United States, even though I had steadfastly, staunchly opposed Hamilton's first bank. But war can change a man, and it certainly changed me.
I hope you all in the audience are happy with the level of the national debt that you support today. I hope you are happy with the taxes that you are asked to pay every April 15th. And I hope you are happy supporting a permanent military establishment which engages in frivolous wars in far corners of the earth. I believe that armies, debts, and taxes were oppressive to a citizenry and detrimental to the liberties of the country. That's what I believe.
Spoken by the man who engaged in a war with the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean.
The shores of Tripoli, sent the Marines.
Further questions? Yes.
If Social Security today is used so much to mask the federal deficit, I'm not clear what was used to mask the large war debt and the problems that they had back then. That's just a general question.
The United States government, under my administration, and indeed until the American Civil War, did not tax its citizens. It's hard to believe. The government did not tax its citizens. There were two sources of revenue. One was the tariff, a tax on imports, and the other was money derived from the sale of public lands in the West. And that was sufficient to support a government which did not engage in extraterritorial actions in my lifetime.
I think you have to keep in mind the average American lived to be 45 years old in 1900, so Social Security was a non-issue. As far as tariffs are concerned, there's no doubt. I really appreciate what Mr. Madison here has just said, that after the War of 1812, after letting the National Bank expire, the states went right back to what they were doing before during the Articles. And we had massive economic problems. Furthermore, the Jeffersonians were dead against tariffs. And unfortunately, Mr. Madison felt compelled in 1815, I believe, to establish a protective tariff. These are two Hamiltonian measures, and even critics said that Madison out-Hamiltoned Hamilton at the end there, but I appreciate you mentioning that.
I would ask you why that great Democrat, Andrew Jackson, had to destroy the bank that you signed into existence.
Carrot comment, it's your bank.
Jackson destroyed the bank because Jackson was Jackson. I'm sorry, and that was a disaster. He doesn't belong in the $20 bill.
Further questions? Anyone? Yes?
Since we reached the subject both of economics and military power, would any of you like to comment on the so-called Whiskey Rebellion?
Whiskey Rebellion.
I thought that might come up. The Whiskey Rebellion pertains to an excise tax I believe Hamilton wanted levied on whiskey produced by farmers in western Pennsylvania. I think his premise was they're not paying cash, they're getting a benefit, and there has to be something, they have to kick in their share. And of course, customs officials were sent out to collect the revenue, and they were harassed, tortured, beaten, whatever you want to say. I don't know if anybody was killed. But Hamilton, of course, his view is we have got to send a message. We can't let that kind of disrespect to the federal government go unpunished. And Washington and Hamilton led a force of 13,000 men against a handful of farmers. And I think Hamilton obviously showed more zeal in crushing this rebellion than Washington. But I think, again, I go back to Shays' Rebellion. And I just can't tell you what an indelible impression that event left on our minds about mobocracy. And while you could argue that the response was over the top, I think it was critical at that time to send a message that the United States government will not tolerate abuse of its members.
The corn growers who had no other way of getting the crops to market profitably other than putting it in the whiskey didn't count as oppression. Their murder didn't count as oppression. The use of federal forces to maintain control of the United States government over its own population was not what that
A little rebellion now and then clears the air like a summer storm. The tree of liberty must be watered periodically by the blood of patriots and tyrants. I believe the Washington administration overreacted to the whiskey distillers in western Pennsylvania, and I believe the governor of Massachusetts overreacted to the oppressed farmers in western Massachusetts.
Further questions?
Stepping back into the present. Stand up.
Please.
I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Stepping into the present, I would be interested in what you personally have to say about Alexander Hamilton. Any opinions you might have.
The question basically...
current opinions of what we think, or what our personalities here would think of Hamilton. I think Adams overreacted in a personal way, but I think Hamilton was pretty much the devil incarnate.
And as Washington, I never had a son of my own. And I can't help but think, it's been mentioned, the more I think about it, the more it kind of sets in my mind that Hamilton was the son that Washington never had, and maybe Washington was to a degree the father, perhaps that Alexander Hamilton never really knew.
His portrait is on the $10 bill, and I wish I had more of them.
Further questions? Well, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.